Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So our next speaker is Dane Corneal. Dane is going to introduce his work on attractor networks enable preplay and rapid path planning in maze-like environments.
So thank you for that introduction. So the basic idea that I'm considering here is one of the cognitive map. So we know that rats, like humans, if they're given enough time to explore and learn about an area, they can develop a fairly sophisticated model of it. Such that, for instance, if this experimenter introduces a new reward site within this environment that the rat is familiar with, the rat can very quickly plan a path back to that reward. And it can also very rapidly update its policy with changing reward positions over time. So the question here is, how can this rat develop a neural representation or a cognitive map of this space that allows it to plan a path between different start and goal positions within this environment? So I'm going to be looking today at one potential model of a cognitive map that can be applied to this pathfinding problem. Because it's a neural model, it's inspired by the dynamics that we see in hippocampus during a path planning task. And finally, I'll be using an attractor network formulation and looking at how an attractor network might not only be useful for representing space, but also for planning perspective trajectories through space. So if we look at the coding properties in hippocampus during any sort of spatial task, what we see is this very classic place cell phenomenon. So these are neurons or place cells that tend to respond when the animal is within a specific region of the environment, defined by its place field, with a firing rate that in open environments is usually described with a Gaussian-like kernel. So the firing rate falls off with distance from a particular point called the place field center. And we also see that these place fields exist along a variety of spatial scales within the hippocampus, from about 20 centimeters across up to 10 meters across in very large environments. So what a network of these place cells give us, if they all have slightly different place fields, is a population code for the animal's current position in space. So the set of neurons firing at any one point in time could be decoded by a downstream population in order to get an estimate of the animal's current position. Now, this population code usually corresponds to the animal's actual position in space. But what's been shown is that during short bursts of activity, sometimes this code can trace out a trajectory through space away from the animal's actual location. So in particular here, Pfeiffer and Foster looked at this activity when the animal was stationary within an environment before it started moving along a novel path towards a known goal position. And what they found was that during these bursts of activity before the animal started moving, the population code tended to represent a trajectory through this environment that approximated a path towards this goal position, and also did so in a way that was predictive of the animal's future path through the environment. So this raises the question of whether the hippocampus might not only be involved in sort of a passive spatial representation function, but also a more active path planning process. So the basic model that I'm going to be using to look at whether we can explain both of these phenomena is a bump attractor network. So this is a very common model of hippocampal activity. And the idea here, again, is that we have this cell that responds within a specific region of this environment defined by its place field when the rat is within that region. And we can line up these cells within the network according to their place field centers. and then apply a feed-forward stimulus to this network corresponding to a given position in space. So in this case, we get a bump in firing rates where the neurons with place field centers closest to the center of this positional input fire the most. Now, in a bump attractor network, we have this specific profile of recurrent connectivity, such that neurons with similar place field centers tend to excite one another, and they tend to inhibit neurons with distant place field centers. And what this gives the network is a sort of memory function, such that it can retain this bump in firing rates for some time after this feed-forward stimulus has been removed. And this could also act as a sort of intrinsic denoising property of the hippocampus in response to this incoming positional input to the circuit. So I'm going to be looking at, first of all, basically generalizing this classical bump attractor network model to more complicated environments. So I'll be doing that first by looking at a way of representing the topology of these environments in a way that we can relate to pathfinding. And then generalizing this bump attractor so that rather than representing these sorts of artificial infinite lines or rings, they could be placed within a 2D environment with walls and obstacles. And then finally, I'll be looking at whether the dynamics of these bump attractor networks could be involved in long-distance pathfinding, specifically in the case of bump attractor networks incorporating large place field neurons. So the way in which I'm considering this basically is that we want to find some sort of algorithm that allows a network to determine a path from a given position within the environment towards a given goal position. And I think of this here in terms of a particular value or closeness function induced by a goal position within the environment that the animal wants to ascend in order to get closer to that goal position. Now, if this network, for instance, it were representing positions in terms of x and y coordinates, this would be very complicated to determine if there's any sort of obstacles blocking the animal's direct path towards that goal. So instead, I'm going to be using a topology of this environment based on the specific features of this maze. And I'll be doing that using the successor representation. So this was a framework that was put forward by Peter Dayan back in 1993, and it was used in a model of hippocampal activity here at NIPS just last year by Stachenfeld et al. And what we can get out of this successor representation basically is the expected occupancy of a given position within this environment, assuming that the animal starts from other states or positions within this environment and performs a localized random walk running forward into the future. And a useful property of this is that if we use a successor representation to represent spatial environments, we can come up with a mapping of these states within the environment into a new vector space, which I'll call the successor coordinate space, where this value or closeness function is given by the scalar product between the representation of one state or position and the representation of the current goal. So the idea is to use a network that's representing positions in terms of these successor coordinates, and the fact that in this case this value gradient is given by the representation of the goal position itself, and then look at moving this network representation towards a position that's closer to the goal, so a trajectory that the animal can follow in order to move towards the goal position. So here I'm going to basically look at reinterpreting this bump attractor network I described before in terms of the successor coordinate representation. So these coordinates basically correspond to a weighted version of the eigenvectors of this environmental transition matrix based on a localized random walk. So what this gives us is a set of functions of increasing spatial frequency across this environment. And when we define the input to this circuit in terms of the successor coordinates and also the input weights in terms of these successor coordinates, what this gives us is a resulting place field that in this case respects the specific topology of the environment as we see in experiments. So for instance here it respects the walls within this maze. Now in addition we can look at the activity of a whole network of neurons representing different points in this environment. So here I plotted them. Each colored pixel corresponds to the activity of a given rate-based neuron in response to this input, where its color indicates its activity. And what we get is a bump in firing rates around neurons with place field centers similar to this positional input. Now from this we can come up with a population decoding. So a representation based on how these neurons respond to different inputs of the position currently being represented by the network. And then using this attractor network formulation by Elias, Smith, and Anderson, here I essentially project this population representation back onto the network itself through a set of recurrent weights. So this gives the network a sort of integrator or memory function that allows it to maintain this bump of firing rates in this transformed environment over time. And we can look at the temporal dynamics of this S-rec, so this successor coordinates represented by the network. And with match strength in the input and recurrent weights, this can be seen as sort of a low-pass filter with a long time constant tau. So essentially, we're updating this position over time with new sensory information coming in through S-in, where this bump, as a result, will follow the animal's movement through this environment. Now, secondly, we can think of this in terms of a pathfinding network. And in this case, I'm going to apply a position representing a given goal within this environment. And now we can see these dynamics in terms of S-rec, or the position represented by the network, as moving towards this goal position, so ascending this value gradient, with the addition of this slow leak that controls the overall level of activities of the neurons within the network, and also stabilizes the activity when this S-rec reaches the goal position. So the idea here is to look at how the representation of the position changes over time in response to an input representing a goal position in order to determine a trajectory that the animal should follow, a local trajectory, to move closer to the goal. Now, this integration basically depends on how close this representation is to actual positions in space. So one problem we can run into is that if these positions, the original position and the goal position, are very far apart in space, instead of getting a smooth movement of this population representation from one to another, we get a jump from one to the next. So here I've applied an original stimulus corresponding to the current position, and then a second stimulus corresponding to a goal position. And this population representation, or this bump of activity, basically bumps or jumps from the original stimulus to the goal position. So in order to look at potential means of counteracting this, basically we're going to develop a set of larger place fields that spread out throughout a greater proportion of the environment from a low dimensional representation of these successor coordinates. So here I've removed these less significant, higher spatial frequency successor coordinates from this representation. And this approximation gives us a set of larger place fields that spread out throughout the environment, and also a large bump in activity rates. And as a result, now when we do the same thing, so I start with the initial stimulus representing a given position. where the bump is now much larger and spreads out to incorporate more neurons within this network, and then apply a stimulus representing the same goal. There's a smooth movement in this activity profile between the initial stimulus and the goal position, giving a potential trajectory that the animal could follow to move towards the goal. And in fact, we can decode this very initial movement of this bump in order to determine how the rat could move in order to get closer to the goal position. So here I've basically initialized the network with bumps at different positions throughout this environment, and then the arrowhead represents the initial movement of this bump in response to a particular goal position. And we can think of this as the movement or the trajectory traced out if the rat is at a given position with a given bump of activity, and there is a feed-forward stimulus applied to the network representing a goal position. And since this goal position is represented within this feed-forward stimulus, which can be updated on the fly, basically we can get different trajectories throughout this environment, throughout the same environment, by applying different feed-forward stimuli and looking at the resulting trajectory traced out by the population representation. So what these successor coordinates give us is a means of rapid pathfinding between different positions within a particular environment, and also a means of generalizing these sort of classical bump attractors to more complicated environments involving walls and obstacles. And then finally, when we develop this low-dimensional truncation resulting in these larger bump attractors, these could implement a long-distance pathfinding process between distant points within an environment, reflected in sequential activity, as we see in the hippocampal representation. So just in closing, I'd like to thank my lab and my funding source, as well as my supervisor, Professor Gerstner.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Oh yeah, and while we take the questions, the presenters for the spotlights, could you please come to the front now? Okay, so in your setting, if I understand correctly, you assume that you have the map given from the beginning, the maze?
Yeah. So these basis vectors that I saw, these eigenvectors, which can be used to develop this map. One possibility is that these could come out of some sort of learning process based on hierarchical slow feature analysis. So this is something I talked about a bit more in the paper, but this is an active research topic, looking at how these types of functions could explain place cell activity starting just from raw visual input.
Okay, thank you.
Have you thought about the role of grid cells in terms of path planning, in terms of integrating with the place cells grid coordinate system there?
Yeah, so this paper that I briefly mentioned last year talked or suggested that grid cells in more complicated environments might be doing something like these non-localized functions, these eigenvectors that I showed way back when. So this could act as a coordinate system. So here I use them as a coordinate system to develop these place cells. And one possibility is that if these grid cells transform in more complicated environments in accordance with these types of functions, that that might explain how it could be a basis for this type of complicated place cell behavior.
Okay, thank you very much.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.